Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to my May wrap-up. Today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in the month of May. So I had a bit of a weird reading month in May. I feel like I didn't read very much, but I did actually read 12 things. I think one or two of them are very short, and I think 5 of them were on audiobook, which is maybe why I don't feel like I spent as much time reading in May, but May just ended up being a very busy month. So I didn't get through that much of my May TBR, so I think instead of doing a TBR video for June, I'm just going to carry over the half of my May TBR that I didn't read over into June, plus a few other things, and we'll see how much of that I get read by the end of the month. In May, I read a mix of things. I did end up managing to read quite a few things for the Spoonies Readathon, which I was pleased about, but I didn't end up reading much from Misery May. Well, I didn't read anything that I had put on my TBR specifically for the readathon Misery May, but I did read some books that were very sad, so I feel like that probably does count. So anyway, let me start off as I always do with some classics, and first I have some poetry to talk about. This is Come Close by Sappho. So this is a collection of Sappho's poetry bound up in a little penguin black classic, so it's only sort of 50 pages long. Sappho, if you don't know, is an ancient Greek poet, and she is where we get the term sapphic from, and also in fact the term lesbian, because she was from the island of Lesbos, and she's kind of best known for writing romantic poetry about other women, and it was really interesting to read some of her poems. I quite liked these poems. I wouldn't say I love them. I feel like I didn't get a ton out of them, or like none of them really stuck with me that much, but I did find them really interesting to read. I also feel like I think whoever edited this little collection together was kind of trying to show the variety of Sappho's work. So there's quite a lot of different themes and things explored. There's quite a few poems about the Trojan War, there's quite a few things about gods and goddesses and that kind of thing, which I found quite interesting, but I feel like that does mean there were less love poems to other women in here, and I feel like that was one of the things I was most interested in, and there were some poems about that in here, but not that many. Maybe I'll read some more Sappho in the future, maybe I won't, but I was kind of interested to pick this up. And then moving from ancient Greece to 19th century Britain, I also read A Tale of Two Cities by Charles Dickens. This was our pick for the Mega Dickens read-along for May. If you don't know what the Mega Dickens read-along is, I will leave some links down in the description, but basically it is a 2-year-long read-along where we're reading the novels of Charles Dickens in publication order. This book is one of Dickens's later works. He published it quite near the end of his career in 1859, and it is a work of historical fiction written during the Victorian period, but set before and leading up to and during the French Revolution, looking at the experiences of one family, Lucy Manette and her father, Dr. Manette. At the beginning of the novel, Dr. Manette has just been released from an unjust imprisonment. He has been in prison without trial for nearly 2 decades, and he is reunited at the beginning of the book with his daughter Lucy, and we follow their experiences over a number of decades in the run-up to the French Revolution. I've made a separate video with all my reflections and thoughts about A Tale of Two Cities, which may be up already or may be going up soon after this, but I will go into a lot more depth with my thoughts on it there rather than here. This was a reread for me. It's been about 10 years since I last read it, and I did enjoy it in a lot of ways, but I also feel like it's not one of my favourite Dickens, and I feel like it kind of went down a little bit in my estimation on this reread. Reading it so close to a lot of other Dickens novels, I feel like actually it kind of falls a bit flat for me in comparison. I feel like the themes are really, really interesting and the plot is great, and the ending of A Tale of Two Cities is fantastic. The ending is amazing, but in general I feel like the characterisation falls a little bit flat for me in this book in comparison to Dickens's other novels. It's not a novel that is focused on characterisation in the same way that most of his books are, and there are a few characters, especially Lucy Manette and Charles Darnay, who feel not very well developed for me, and therefore that means A Tale of Two Cities is just not my favourite Dickens. Charles Dickens is my favourite author. I love his books a lot, so one of my lesser favourite Dickens is still a book that I think is amazing, but I do think that this isn't very high up in my Dickens ranking, just because the characterisation isn't what I want. In general, I just like a Dickens novel that is 1,000 pages long rather than 450 pages long. So I'm really glad that I reread it. It was really nice to reread it. I've been loving doing the Mega Dickens read-along, but definitely not my favourite Dickens book. Then I reread one other Victorian work in May, and that was The Grey Woman by Elizabeth Gaskell. This is a long short story novella by Elizabeth Gaskell, one of her Gothic tales. This tells the story of a young woman her ill-advised marriage and the consequences of it. It has a kind of Bluebeard retelling feel to it, and there are a few really interesting characters, especially the character of Armand, who I think is fantastic. I really enjoyed rereading this one. I ended up rereading it just because me and my husband Nick had a long car journey to go on, and I always like to reread something if I'm driving, so we ended up listening to The Grey Woman just because I already had the Gothic Tales audiobook on my phone, and it was about the right length for the car journey, and I really enjoyed rereading it. Next, let's move on to some historical fiction. So the next 3 books I'm going to speak about are all books that I read because they were on the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction long list. So I've already posted a review video reviewing those 3 books in a lot more detail than I'll go into here, so I'll leave that link down below, but I will talk briefly about them here as well. So one book that I read was Absolutely and Forever by Rose Tremaine. This novel is set in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and it follows the character of Marianne, who at the beginning of the book is a young teenager who has just started a relationship with a boy called Simon. She is desperately in love with him. She believes that she will love him absolutely and forever. And this book kind of looks at Marianne, her teenage years, her coming of age, how this great love of her life, as she views it, kind of affects her life. It's very, very short, and it almost feels like a short story to me in its like structure, even though it is a novel. I feel like this was a really interesting book because most of the way through I was kind of quite enjoying it, but I wasn't loving it. I was maybe a bit frustrated with the characters. It is very much a story of kind of like the upper middle classes, upper classes, and at times Marianne's kind of like naive bubble felt a little bit frustrating. But towards the end of the book, there are a few kind of surprise things you learn which kind of change your reading of the rest of the book, and I feel like I really, really liked those elements. I feel like they were done really well and were really clever and really made me re-evaluate the rest of the novel. So I ended up going away from the novel with a really positive experience, and it's definitely one I'd recommend. It probably is on the more kind of like literary end of what I read, so I feel like this is probably one for people who enjoy literary fiction slightly more than I do, but I still found it really interesting and I'm glad that I read it. Then another book I read from the shortlist of the Walter Scott Prize for Historical Fiction was In the Upper Country by Kai Thomas. This is a really interesting novel set in 19th century Canada in a town almost exclusively occupied by people of colour. This is a town that takes in a lot of people who have fled from enslavement in the US. And in the town of Dunmore, we are following a character called Cinder. Cinder, unlike a lot of other people in Dunmore, has actually come from the north. She's from somewhere further up north in Canada, and she has come to Dunmore. We don't really know why. She's here working partly as a journalist, and in the beginning of the novel, she gets kind of caught up in a series of events where an older woman who has just arrived in Dunmore, along with several other people, all of whom have fled from the US where they were enslaved. And shortly after this old woman arrives at this town, a bounty hunter who has been sent to track her down comes to the town as well. She shoots and kills him, and while she is in prison awaiting trial, Cinder goes to visit her, and they kind of end up exchanging stories. Cinder tells the old woman stories, some from her own life, some stories that she's heard, and the old woman in turn tells Cinder about her own life and her experiences in slavery. I think this book is really, really interesting for a lot of reasons. One of the things I really, really liked about it, and one of the things the author kind of talks about in his author's notes being one of the real kind of aims of the book, is that the book looks a lot at the close relationships between Black and Indigenous groups in North American history and about the role of Indigenous people in the Underground Railroad and things like that. That element of the book was really interesting and felt unusual, and I thought it was done really well. I also loved how the novel was kind of a tapestry of lots of different stories, and some of the stories kind of stand on their own, and some of the stories you kind of see connections with other stories later, and I feel like the use of kind of like different stories and voices within the novel just worked really well, and was very, very effective. Again, I feel like this was at the more like literary end of my taste, and I feel like I could have done with another like 5 chapters at the end telling me more of what happened after the novel, but I think that's just my personal taste, and I did understand why it ended where it did. In general, I thought it was a great novel and definitely one I'd recommend. And then the final Walter Scott Prize book I read in May was this is Music in the Dark by Sally Magnuson. This one was on the long list, but sadly it didn't make the shortlist, and I am very sad that it didn't make the shortlist because I thought it was fantastic. I really, really enjoyed this one. This is a novel set in 19th century Scotland, partly focusing on the Highland clearances. And the Highland clearances, if you don't know, is when many people of Celtic origin who were living in Scotland in the Highlands were forcibly evicted from their land in the 18th and 19th century in order to make more room for sheep grazing and whatever else the upper classes wanted to do with this land. And in this book, we're following a woman called Jamesina, who is now living in Glasgow in her 40s or 50s. And at the beginning of the book, we know that she has recently got married to a man who has been her lodger. We know that they're married in the summer, and we also know that he turned up at her house back in the autumn. She recognised him from her past, he didn't recognise her. And throughout this novel, from both his and her perspective, we get to see what links them together in the past. We get to learn about their lives and their experiences during the Highland clearances many years ago, as well as the novel kind of giving us this second chance love story for these two people who are a bit older, who have had a really rough time in life. And I just thought this was a beautiful love story, as well as being a really powerful book about place and people and memory, and the way this book looks at music as well. I just thought it was fantastic, and I'd really, really recommend it. What a wonderful book. Moving away from historical fiction, I also read some books in May that are set in the present day, one of which was The Antique Hunter's Guide to Murder by C.L. Miller. The Antique Hunter's Guide to Murder is a murder mystery kind of themed around antiques. We're following a woman called Freya, who's in her 40s, kind of going through a tough time in life. Her daughter has kind of grown up and moved abroad, and her ex-husband is making her sell her house. And then she hears from her aunt Carol that a man called Arthur has died. Arthur is her aunt's best friend and used to be her boss. Arthur ran an antique shop and was also kind of involved in tracking down antiques that had been stolen and restoring them to their owners. Arthur and Freya used to work together. Freya used to be an antique hunter with him, but they haven't spoken for many, many years. Carol believes that Arthur may have been murdered, and so Carol and Freya kind of team up to work together to try and find out what might have happened, and everything kind of goes on from there. I listened to the audiobook of this, which I really enjoyed, and in general, I really enjoyed this novel. I thought the characterization was really great, especially of Aunt Carol, and it was just a really satisfying mystery. I also had a very, very unique experience of reading The Antique Hunter's Guide to Murder. So C.L. Miller is the daughter of Judith Miller, who was a very well-renowned antiques expert in the UK. If you've ever seen Antiques Roadshow, Judith Miller used to be on that a lot. Judith Miller passed away last year, and I actually used to work with Judith Miller. As I mentioned from time to time on this channel, I'm an editor. These days I pretty much only edit fiction, but I actually started off my career editing antiques guides for Judith Miller, working with her on her antiques guides. So these are the books that I used to work on with Judith. Antiques price guides, which basically like go through lots of different kinds of antiques and like tell you how much antiques are worth and give you kind of historical context and information about antiques. And I had a really, really lovely time in the 2 years that I worked with Judith. I guess I must have been 24 when I started working with her, and I love history and I love like historical objects, so editing antiques books was so fun. And because I worked with Judith for 2 years helping edit the antiques price guides, I actually do know quite a lot about antiques, or at least I used to know a lot about antiques many years ago, but still a lot of the information remains in my brain. And obviously because I was working with Judith, all my knowledge about antiques and my interest in antiques was very, very influenced by Judith's taste in antiques. And obviously C.L. Miller, being the daughter of Judith Miller, her taste in antiques and her knowledge of antiques was really influenced by her mum, and that meant that like reading The Antique Hunter's Guide to Murder was like really nostalgic and quite emotional, and like I just knew like every antique that was mentioned. I was like, I remember that. Like one of the important antiques in the book is a Martin Brothers Wally bird, and the moment it was mentioned I was like, oh, I know what a Wally bird is, and I just had this image in my head, which actually I was talking recently about visualization and reading, and I don't have much visual imagination, but I do have a visual memory, and so I feel like usually when I read I don't have visual images in my head, but every time an antique was mentioned in The Antique Hunter's Guide to Murder, I had like a page of Miller's price guide in my head with all the images on, and like I know what a Wally bird is, and it was just really, really lovely and fun. So it was just really lovely to read this novel and find it like packed with antiques references that I knew, and the really nice 2 years we spent working together. So obviously that was a very unique and unusual reading experience, but I do recommend The Antique Hunter's Guide to Murder for anyone who enjoys a good cosy crime and likes antiques. It was really good fun. Then I also read Act Your Age, Eve Brown by Talia Hibbert, which is a rom-com. This book is following Eve and Jacob. Eve is 26 years old and her life is in a bit of a mess, and her parents have kind of given her an ultimatum and said she needs to get a job and actually stick to it this time, and so she ends up kind of driving away from her family home in sort of a rage, beach, and when she spots a job interview for a chef at a B&B, she decides to just go for it. Lots of messy, complicated things happen from there, but she ends up staying at this B&B and helping run the place and cook and working for the owner of the B&B, Jacob. And of course there is some romantic tension growing between Jacob and Eve. There's both kind of like an enemies to lovers and a bit of a friends to lovers thing going on here. Jacob and Eve immediately don't like each other but then soon become friends, and things kind of go on from there. I really enjoyed Act 8 of Each Brown, as I have enjoyed all the 3 books in the Brown Sisters series. The 3 books in the series, Get a Life Chloe Brown, Take a Hint Danny Brown, and Act 8 Eve Brown, each take one of 3 sisters as their protagonist. I feel like my favourite book is still Get a Life Chloe Brown, and my favourite sister of the 3 sisters is probably Chloe. But I think actually my favourite of the love interest is probably Jacob. I feel he was a really interesting character. He's autistic, and I feel like the way the novel explores that, to my mind, seemed done really well, and was really interesting. Him and Eve kind of both feel like they don't always fit in quite different ways, and the way that's kind of explored and discussed in the novel I thought was really well done. And in general, it was a really sweet, enjoyable romance. And then I also read Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin, which was just incredible. This was my favourite book of the month, and this was just amazing. One of my favourite books of the year. I have many, many thoughts, and I thought this was so incredible. Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow is one of those books where there has been so much hype around it, and I don't think I believed that the hype could be real and that it could be warranted, but it's so warranted. This book is fantastic, and I genuinely think it's one of the best books I've ever read. This novel is a book about friendship, and there are 3 kind of key characters in this novel. I feel like everyone who talks about this novel says that it's about Sadie and Sam, but I actually feel like it's about Sadie and Sam and Marks, and Marks was also a really important character in this book, and I really liked Marks. For me, it was very much a book about 3 friends, not just a book about 2 friends. Sam and Sadie first meet when they are children. Sam is in hospital following a car accident where he has been badly injured. He's broken a lot of bones in his leg. Sadie is going to hospital very regularly because her sister is being treated for cancer, and Sam and Sadie end up meeting in the games room of this hospital and playing video games together. I think this would be the 80s when they first meet. They then reconnect when they're both students at university, and they decide to start designing games together, and Sam's flatmate Marks kind of also ends up getting involved in like helping them with the business side of things. And this book ends up following the friendship between these 3 people, and also the company that they create and the games that this company makes. There was so much that I loved in this book. It is a really wonderful novel about friendship, and I feel like it's a really good novel about how people can know each other really, really well, but also not understand each other at all. Like, I feel like that was explored really, really well. The characterization in this book is absolutely impeccable and incredible and so well done. All of the characters in this book feel intensely human and real, and I thought the characterization was wonderful, especially because I didn't like all the characters all the time. I think especially I got quite frustrated with Sadie. Like, a lot of the time I found myself more on Sam's side than Sadie's side, but even when Sadie was frustrating me, I feel like you totally understood why she was acting as she did. Both Sam and Sadie are drawn so well, but also Marks is a fantastic character. Like I said, I feel like I haven't heard enough people talking about Marks, and for me this was a book about 3 people who were friends, not about 2 people who were friends. And it was also a book about how in a group of 3 friends, there is 1 3, but there are also 3 2s. And looking at the dynamics between Sam and Sadie, between Sadie and Marks, between Sam and Marks, and between the 3 of them as a 3 was really, really interesting and an element that I loved in this book. And also it is obviously a book that is in a way about games, and a book about the kind of video games industry, which I really, really loved and found really, really interesting. I'm not someone who spends a lot of time gaming, but mostly because I have very poor hand-eye coordination, so I'm not very good at using video game controllers. More than because I don't like video games. And there are a few games, either like on PC or on Xbox, that I have really enjoyed over the last few years. And actually it was quite well timed reading this in May, because me and Nick have been really enjoying playing Baldur's Baldur's Gate lately. And I also grew up playing Game Boy games and computer games, and even if I'm not very good at playing lots of games, I'm really interested in games, and I feel like games as a kind of like newer medium of storytelling are really interesting. So I really loved all the stuff about video games in here, but I also feel like you absolutely don't have to care at all about video games to love this book, because it is just about people. It made me think actually of when I read Malibu Rising by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and there's so much in that book about surfing, and I have absolutely zero interest in surfing, but my goodness did I care about surfing when it was this family surfing together. And I feel like Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow is just that. Like, no matter how little interest you have in games, when it is these people making games together, you will care. And yes, it is about people making games together, but it's also about friends working together in an office corporate environment, and also about friends working together in a creative way on creative things, and how creative differences and differences of ideals and difficulties around communication can cause problems. I read this book partly for the Spoonies Readathon, as I mentioned earlier. At the beginning of the book, we know that Sam has been injured in a car accident and broken a lot of bones in his foot. Throughout the novel, he has problems with his leg, with his foot, chronic pain, difficulties with walking, and I feel like the way this book looked at disability and Sam's experience of that was really, really well done and really complicated. I'm really glad that I read this book for the Spoonies Readathon, because I feel like that was a really strong element of this book. I also just loved the way this novel was written. Like, I thought the writing was incredible and rich, but also really accessible and engaging. There's also some kind of interesting use of mixed media and sort of articles and interviews and things like that, which I really enjoyed. I found it a really, really emotional novel, and there's certain things that happen in the second half of the novel that are really, really emotional, and I like wept through a lot of this book. And I mean, like, proper, I had to take a pause because I couldn't see the words because my eyes were so full of tears, and I just found this like such an emotional, powerful, rich reading experience. I just thought it was incredible. Genuinely one of the best books I've ever read. I also wanted to say that I feel like I've heard a lot about this book, and one of the reasons why I didn't read it was because I don't always get on with literary fiction, and I feel like I've heard about the spoken as literary fiction, but I feel like it's much more on the reading group end. Like, I feel like actually the reading experience of this was much more for me like reading a Taylor Jenkins Reid book than it was like reading a really, really experimental literary fiction novel. Like, it's not like that at all. I found this really accessible, really powerful, really emotional. It's very character driven, but there's also a lot of plot and there's a lot going on, and it's very easy to read. And I feel like that's maybe just worth saying, because I feel like I've heard this spoken about in a way that made me think it was more literary than it was, maybe. I don't know. I just thought this was amazing, and I just really, really, really recommend it so much. It was just beautiful and incredible and powerful, and this great story of friendship and creativity and just people being people, and the ending was amazing, and just, yeah, I just love it. Very, very, very fantastic book, and yeah, what a book, what a book. Finally, I have a few things that aren't novels to talk about, one of which is this poetry collection, All the Names Given, by Raymond Antrobus. This is another book I read for the Spoonies Readathon after I heard it recommended from Olivia Savannah from Olivia's Catastrophe. Raymond Antrobus is deaf, and he writes about that in a few poems in this collection, as well as writing about heritage and memory and love. There were some very hard-hitting poems in here, and in general as a collection I thought it worked really well. There were a few poems that went over my head, which I think does happen sometimes with poetry, and I will say that just like looking down the contents list now, trying to think of what my favourite poem was, I don't know that I could like pick a favourite poem from it, so I don't know how much like the individual poems will stay with me, but I feel like as a collection it was really strong. And then I also read two non-fiction books in May, both of which I started in April actually. One was Once Upon a Tome by Oliver Darkshire. The subtitle of this is The Misadventures of a Rare Bookseller, and this is a kind of light-hearted, humorous memoir talking about Oliver Darkshire's experiences working in rare and antiquarian bookselling at a bookseller's called Southerns. I really enjoyed this. It's a good fun, pretty light-hearted and very funny memoir, and has a lot of interesting things to say about the antiquarian and rare bookselling world. I was actually reading this at the same time as I was listening to An Antique Hunter's Guide to Murder by C.L. Miller, and obviously antiquarian books is like a sort of small subsection of antiques that is mostly separate from antiques, but they do have like some crossover, so I found it quite interesting to kind of read those two together. I thought this was a really fun, and I really enjoyed Oliver Darkshire's writing style. It's very like witty and wry, and this was just an enjoyable read. And then I also listened to The Language Puzzle by Stephen Mithen, and this is a very different kind of non-fiction, much more academic than Once Upon a Tome. The Language Puzzle is a book about language and the history of language, and it kind of combines linguistics, anthropology, archaeology, psychology and biology, I guess, to try and work out how language works, how it might have evolved, why humans use language, and how language might have come into being, and to kind of try and create a history of language as a thing. I heard about this book from Willow Talks Books. I'll leave her channel link down below. And me and my husband Nick listened to it together because we're both kind of interested in language and linguistics. And I kind of both loved it and found it a real struggle. I'm very glad that I listened to the audiobook because I don't think I would have been able to read the physical book. Basically, I feel like I am very much not a sciencey person and very much of a history person. So in the chapters where Stephen Mitton was talking about linguistics and archaeology and history, I was really interested and I could follow his argument. And then in the chapters when he was talking about biology and like neuroscience, I just was so confused and so much stuff went over my head. And there were quite a few long sections that we just really struggled to understand. I feel like it probably is on the more like accessible end of academic, but it is still a bit academic in terms of my general reading. Which I feel was okay actually on audiobook, because any bit that I just couldn't follow I just let wash over me, but I feel like if I'd been reading it physically I probably would have DNF'd it, which is not to say that I didn't get a lot out of it. I really did, but I also found it quite hard. The way the book is kind of set out is that Stephen Mitton kind of goes through lots of different fields and talks about the evidence from these different fields and what they can tell us about the history of language and the evolution of language, and he basically kind of presents all his evidence, and then in the conclusion he kind of explains what he thinks actually happened and how he thinks language actually evolved. And I feel like for me the weighting was maybe not quite right, or the conclusion was not quite long enough. Like I feel like either I wanted his argument and his conclusion to be longer, or I wanted his argument to be more interweaved with his evidence than it was. But regardless, I did find this a really interesting read, and I think if you're interested in linguistics and the history of language, and also maybe if you're slightly more sciencey than me, then you might find the language puzzle really fascinating. I did find it really fascinating, I just also found it quite tricky, so I feel like I'd be like slightly wary recommending it to everyone, but if it sounds like the kind of thing you'd find interesting, then it is worth a read. So there we go, those are the 12 books I read in May. I feel like I've been talking for ages, so apologies if this video has been a bit long, but I had a good reading month. I read a lot of really interesting things in May, and yeah, tomorrow and tomorrow and tomorrow will be with me for a long time. What a fantastic book. Definitely my highlight of the month, one of my highlights of the year. Anyway, that is all for now. Do let me know down in the comments if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them. Otherwise, thanks very much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.